Hello, my name is Nile and this is my critical analysis discussion. We'll start with what we discussed in class in lecture one. We talked about life, and life is defined as a self-sustaining chemical system capable of Darwinian evolution. Um, so to understand that definition of life, we got to understand what Darwinian evolution is. And basically, Darwin was a scientist who studied evolution by traveling all around the world, around the Galapagos Islands, and all that. Um, and Darwinian evolution is the idea that only the fittest organisms survives. And by the fittest, I mean the organisms with the most favorable characteristics, favorable traits, um, conducive for the environments that they live in. Those traits are what define them as who's the fittest and who's not, which traits work the best in that environment, who's able to reproduce the most efficiently, who's able to hunt the most efficiently, who's at the top of the food chain. Also extinction plays a part in evolution because um, some species, some organisms do go extinct, um, and that will affect not only the evolution of that species that goes extinct, but also the evolution of those other species who are able to survive. Um, so that's kind of a brief overview of Darwinian evolution and how that relates to life. Um, we also discussed the essentials for life to exist. Um, these building blocks, these elements from the periodic table. Um, these elements are essential for life to exist. Those elements are carbon in its most organic form, because a lot of complex structures have carbon hydrogen backbones. Of course, you have to have carbon to form that carbon hydrogen backbone. So, carbon in its most organic form is essential for life to exist. Hydrogen, as I just mentioned, of course, the carbon hydrogen bonds for those complex organic molecules that are essential for life to exist. Hydrogen plays a role in that. Hydrogen also forms water, and is also bound to many other atoms. Of course, when talking about water, um, scientists believe that water is not native to the Earth itself. They believe that water came from asteroids that crashed into the Earth billions of years ago. Um, these asteroids had water on their surfaces, and that's how water basically got to Earth, arrived at Earth. Um, but of course, hydrogen is important because it forms water, and a lot of a lot of organisms, actually probably the majority of organisms, need water to survive, in order to evolve. um Even just as humans and eukaryotes, water is important for our functions, um as eukaryotes, our cellular functions as eukaryotes. Um, Nitrogen is also essential for life to exist because it forms many carbon-based ring structures and amino acids. I believe most, if not all, amino acids contain nitrogen as an essential part of that amino acid. Of course, amino acids go on to form proteins, polypeptide chains, which are extremely important for our functions as humans, as well as eukaryotes. All eukaryotes, they have those proteins, those polypeptides. So, yes, nitrogen is extremely important. Oxygen, as I mentioned before, water is extremely important. Oxygen helps form water, beside along with hydrogen. Um, Oxygen is also important in forming complex sugars and alcohols. Um, Phosphorus is extremely important. You know, Molecules of life need energy. Um, Phosphorus is extremely important source of that energy because it forms ATP and ADP, um, which a lot of eukaryotes use ATP and ADP. ATP is adenosine triphosphate. ADP is adenosine diphosphate, and those are sources of energy for cells to use, for eukaryotic cells to use, and energy for energy. Um, and I don't believe it's just eukaryotic cells that use ATP, ADP. I believe prokaryotes do as well. So, um, also phosphorus is part of nucleic acids as well, DNA, RNA. They both have phosphorus on their structures. So it's important for, DNA, RNA, which is involved in gene expression, genetic makeup, all of that stuff. Sulfur is also is the last essential building block for life to exist. And sulfur is found in some amino acids. Um, as I mentioned before, amino acids are important for protein synthesis and formation of polypeptides and all those bodily functions associated with polypeptides and proteins. Proteins are actually extremely important in gene expression. So, yeah, sulfur, yeah, um, yeah, and it's complex molecules. As I mentioned before, they form polypeptides. Proteins. They form carbohydrates, which are sugars, different sugars and whatnot, as well as lipids and nucleic acids, which are, lipids, fatty acids, nucleic acids, DNA, RNA. So, all those are involved in forming a complex structure such as cell walls, cell membranes, all that good stuff. Important for us. RNA. All right. So this is extremely important too. Early Earth was an RNA dominated world. RNA is more susceptible to, change, mutations, and mutations are extremely important for evolution. Um, but these mutations, which a mutation is a change in the genetic code. So these mutations help species evolve, helped organisms evolve, especially in the early Earth. Um, like I said, RNA is more susceptible to those mutations, and those mutations are what help organisms adapt to their external environment, and to their needs to survive. So RNA was the dominant nucleic acid in the early Earth. Of course, now we've moved to DNA, which is less susceptible to those mutations. Because while those mutations help species adapt, those mutations can also cause complications with organisms. So, um, we've evolved to a DNA dominant world instead of RNA in terms of eukaryotes. Um, yeah, and then DNA encodes, it transmits and expresses genes. Um, we're also like all organisms are all related in one way, shape, or form. When you look at a phylogenetic tree, which phylogenetic tree has a bunch of branches for basically all organisms that we know of on the earth. Um, when you look at a phylogenetic tree, it's divided in three sections, which are bacteria, archaea, and eukaryotes. Um, each one of those branches, each one of those sections comes down and merges into one point at the bottom. That point at the bottom is what is known as the Luca, which is the last universal common ancestor. Um, and the Luca is how we are all related. It's the great grand parent, whatever, um, that gave rise to all organisms. Um, there are two pathways, two Luca pathways. One is the mitochondrion pathway, which engulfed the proto-mitochondria. The Luca engulfed the proto-mitochondria, and through this process, it gave rise for the Luca or other organisms um, to have cellular respiration abilities. And then the other pathway was the protochloroplast pathway, which Luca absorbed protochloroplast. And of course, we know chloroplasts are involved in photosynthesis, the production of oxygen. Um, the divergence of those two pathways, um, you know, give rise to um, and give rise to animals and plants, prokaryotes, eukaryotes, just based off of those processes. Um, Abiogenetic process was the first evidence of life, which was approximately 4.1 to 3.8 billion years ago. Photosynthetic organisms became to come about around 3.4 billion years ago. Um, we also had to talk about the Great Oxygenation Event, which happened around 2.4 billion years ago. Um, this is actually the first mass extinction of many species of Earth because they weren't able to adapt to the extremely high levels of O2 or oxygen gas um, in the atmosphere. They were not able to adapt to those high levels of oxygen. So um, we that was our first mass extinction. Um, yes. Let's see. Moving along in our lecture, we talked about extremophiles, which are organisms that can withstand extreme conditions, such as heat, temperature, acidity, pH levels. There are so many different types of extremophiles. Um, as I mentioned before, scientists believe that water came from asteroids crashing into the Earth. Um, and then I mentioned the abiogenic process, which was the first evidence of life. Um, Scientists were able to kind of generalize when life began. Um, they're not able to exactly pinpoint it, but they're able to give um, a general time period of when life began, and by looking at stromatolites, by looking um, at microfossils and sedimentary rocks, of course. Stromatolites came about 3.5 billion years ago. Um, they kind of resemble rocks, but they have distinctive layers. The top layers typically are involved with photosynthesis, while the lower layers are they use the byproducts that are produced by the top layer of the stromatolites. Microfossils also date about 3.5 billion years. And analysis of these show that some of the structures of microfossils contain organic carbon, which, as mentioned before, organic carbon is extremely important for life, for those lively functions, of course, for the formation of those organic molecules. And last, I mentioned the sedimentary rocks. These are a little bit older. They date about 3.85 billion years. Um, and the sedimentary rocks contain carbon 12 and carbon 13, which are um, like I said, forms of carbon, essential to life. The biological processes prefer carbon 12 over carbon 13. So yes. Um, Scientists believe that bacteria and archaea um, were the first organisms. They Bacteria and archaea, they're prokaryotic organisms, which means, or one of the characteristics for prokaryotes are that their DNA is distributed all around the cell. The DNA isn't bound inside of a nucleus like eukaryotes are. Prokaryotic DNA is dispersed all around the cell. Oh, excuse me. Um, um, we also talked about the Miller-Urey experiments. These experiments demonstrated, or they tried to demonstrate how life could have formed in the early Earth ages. Um, they tried to demonstrate that through a lab experiment, um, which they used a set of conditions. They tried to create atmospheric conditions. They used water. Um, and at the end of their experiment, they were able to produce amino acids and complex organic molecules. So yeah, that experiment actually demonstrated that, of course, we know amino acids and those organic molecules are essential for life. Um, so that experiment sought to demonstrate how life could have possibly been formed during those early ages. Um, their experiment was flawed, though. One of the flaws was that they only used water as a solvent. They didn't use any other solvents in their experiment. Um, Water was the only solvent that they used, and of course, scientists believe that there was more than just water on the surface. There are other solvents that could have been used. Um, of course, the scientists weren't there, so they don't know exactly what solvents could have been used, but of course, they hypothesized about different solvents. One of the other flaws of this experiment was that um, they used a limited amount of gases. In their experiment, I believe they only used water vapor. I mean, not water vapor. They only used ammonia vapor and methane to create their atmospheric conditions. Um, and as scientists believe, they that there was a vast amount of different gases and that made up the atmosphere during those ages, not just methane and ammonia vapor. And one more flaw that their experiment had was that they only used one energy source. And as we know, there are many energy sources. Their energy source that they used was a spark of electricity to kind of simulate lightning striking. Um, so they could have used a lot of other forms of energy, such as collisions, because we know that the asteroids collide, or we don't know, but we hypothesize that asteroids collided into the Earth. Um, that's the source of energy. They could have also used heat. Heat is always a source of energy. So they could have used a bunch of different sources of energy for their experiment. Um, Moving along in our lecture, we also talked about the concept of panspermia. Excuse me. Panspermia is the idea that life exists everywhere in the universe. Um, and as discussed, this means that life on Earth could have started on Earth, but it could have also started somewhere else and have been brought to Earth by way of asteroids crashing into Earth. So yes, we discussed panspermia. Um, there are of course different schools of thought within that idea of panspermia. Um, One of those is that the um, that organisms evolved on Earth, and the other is that these organisms evolved elsewhere and then were brought to Earth. Um, we also talked about how early Earth was free of oxygen, of O2 gas. Um, so this would definitely be evidence that the first organisms they used anaerobic processes. They used anaerobic metabolism. Um, but of course, we talked about the Great Oxygenation Event earlier that happened about 2.4 billion years ago. That led to the first mass extinction, and that led to organisms evolving um, to adapt to those high levels of oxygen in the atmosphere. Um, Now we live in a world where a lot of organisms rely on those high levels of oxygen to survive. Um, yeah. Let's see. Um, Going back to talking about those mass extinctions, there are a few factors that really contribute to a mass extinction occurring. These factors are climate, meteorite impact, that happens quite a bit, volcanism, air temperature, ocean acidification, water oxygen levels. sea level rise, and atmospheric circulation. All of these factors contribute to mass extinction. Um, and currently, we are actually living in a world where a lot of these factors are present because we haven't been taking care of the earth. We've been um, doing harmful things to the earth that we live on, um, and a lot of these factors are present. So we may be in the midst of another mass extinction happening pretty soon. Um, um, and like I said, that's about most of what we talked about in these first few lectures. Talk a lot about evolution. Um, so yeah.